let's welcome Ben Kemp.
Well, welcome everyone, and I do want to thank the Saratoga County History Center and for arranging this. I absolutely love to share the history of this place, not just the story of Ulysses S. Grant, but this mountain, as you know, holds an extensive history. Not just human history, but also natural history as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about all of that today. And we're going to stop at different stations along the way. Everybody can catch their breath, and that's where we'll do our history segments. At the end of each segment, feel free to ask questions. We may not be able to get to them all, but we will be sharing a small sheet of paper which will take you to our website, different articles I've written, and some I'm still working on the history of this mountain. So there's more to learn than what we can go through today as well. So again, thanks to Jim and the Saratoga County History Center. As he said, definitely check on the other walks that they have this summer and fall, and then also check out the museum down there, see what they've done. They've got great exhibits down there. So Mount McGregor, again, an incredible place. And if you're really going to start at the beginning of Mount McGregor, you have to talk about the rocks we're standing on, right? So we're part of the Canadian Shield, which is a huge formation, which locally is the Adirondack Mountains, known as the Adirondack Mountains. And we're at the very southeastern edge of those mountains. And that's going to play into why this place became a popular place for humans to come. Obviously, the very first humans to come would be, anyone? The Native Americans. So the Mohicans and the Mohawks, obviously there's other names that they use as well, but those are the common names that are known. They would have hunted and gathered nuts, especially on these slopes, berries and nuts. There's still blueberry plants up here to this day. So that would have been its earliest use. And then, of course, beaver trapping once the Europeans came. And we'll talk a little bit about that colonial part of the story as we head down the hill as well. So the history of the mountain goes way back. The rocks are incredibly old that we're standing on. And it's a very interesting geological location. I don't know if anybody knows, but there is an actual fault line. Hopefully no rumbles today. But there is a fault line under our feet. It's called the Saratoga Mount McGregor Fault. And they say that it is responsible for helping the springs, helping create the springs that made Saratoga Springs famous just down the road, and Ballston Spa. We don't want to leave Ballston Spa out. They had their springs too. And Wilton as well, just down the road. So if you'd like, we can move to our first station, which will be at the corner down here. Just feel free to gather anywhere you can on the trail, right at the first corner down here. Okay, well, here we are, stop one. So we are standing on a piece of history right now. You know, people think of history as buildings and structures of different kinds, but we're standing on a piece of history. This is the very first carriage road ever put up the mountain. There's only a few vestiges of it still coming up the mountain, and you can see it coming through right here. This is another old carriage road, but this was the original one that we're standing on right here. Now, we'll bounce around a little bit in our timeline here. This is where Duncan McGregor, who grew up literally in the shadow of the mountain in Wilton, but it would be many years later after he'd established himself in business here and in Glens Falls as a businessman, and he had a little extra income, must be. Now, the story goes that Mr. McGregor ran into a man from the South that was vacationing in Saratoga Springs. This man from the South was told about the views of Mount McGregor. Now, of course, back then, there was nothing but footpaths. And this would be just about towards the end or just after the Civil War. And so he's going to take the carriage up here, then he's going to walk all the way up the mountain, and he runs into Mr. McGregor down in Saratoga Springs and tells him, you know, somebody should do something with that mountain. That would be a great excursion point from Saratoga Springs. So that's how the story goes, that Mr. McGregor received his inspiration from a southern visitor. So sometimes the tourists have the greatest ideas, don't they? And so Duncan McGregor decides to put the first road up here in 1872. And they purchased the mountain for back taxes. And he puts the first road in here with plans to make it into a small excursion resort from Saratoga Springs. Now, this is nothing new in terms of concept. As you may know, people that had the means were escaping the cities during the summertime, starting in the early 1800s. You're probably familiar with the Catskills and their early mountain houses and things like that down there. And again, why? Well, we take for granted, of course, our air conditioning, but they didn't have the air conditioning back then, so this was a way to get up to the cool breezes. But also there was an element of healthful air, that they believed the air was healthy up here. You were away from the hay fever and the diseases, which to some extent was true if you were living in cities back then in the 1870s and 80s. So that's really going to be the reason why McGregor's going to put the road up here. Now they have a huge picnic in September of 1872 to celebrate this new road that he put up here, right here. And you're going to have literally thousands of people coming up the mountain with carriages and walking and Sunday schools. Most of them were Sunday schools and churches from this region. And they're going to come up here. Now, in the planning for this, one of the reverends asked Mr. McGregor, what should we call the place? Because it had been known as Palmerton Mountain before that, because down here, the Wilton was known as Palmerton. And so he suggested, how about Mount McGregor? And McGregor said, well, that's fine with me. I don't think he cared much. And that's how it became Mount McGregor, 1872. And from there, it was a bit of a slow start to developing the resort. But McGregor was determined and had a sawmill up here and was building small structures at first. And we're going to go to the location where those structures were and talk a bit about that later in the tour. But we have McGregor really taking quite a few years to get everything established. Now, Seneca Ray Stoddard, the photographer, came up here while he's doing this in the 1870s. So we do have some images from the 1870s of that very early resort. And so that gives us a wonderful little glimpse into what this place was like in those early days. But there aren't too many images. So, and again, Seneca Ray Stoddard, we have a program about that later here at the site this fall. So take a look at our schedule for that here at the historic site. Very influential local photographer. And again, the photographers and others popularized this place. I mean, by this place, I mean the Adirondack region. And so it helped to eventually preserve it around the time that General Grant came here, the 1880s. It was becoming a forest preserve and protected by New York State. And so the photographers did, and artists did a lot to establishing this place as well. And so that's the beginning of the mountain. Any questions about this period at all? Oh my.
What's involved with making a carriage road?
A lot. What is involved in making a carriage road? Well, on terrain this steep, it was a very difficult task. But fortunately for those with money, labor was very cheap back in the 1870s, especially immigrant labor. And I always like to mention, you know, when people say Duncan McGregor built this road, I don't think Duncan McGregor had his shovel out. Okay, it was generally labor from the area, and I'm sure some of it was immigrant labor as well. So that's what allowed these incredible projects to proceed, and we want to give credit to those that we don't know their names, but they're the ones that did the backbreaking labor to get this steep road up the mountainside. And as you walk down through, take a look to the right-hand side. You'll see some immense boulders on the right-hand side right here around the corner, and those were placed, I'm sure, dragged into place by horse teams. So we'll give a little credit to the horses as well. But this was a steep ride up the mountainside in a carriage from Saratoga Springs. Any guesses as to the length of travel? The length of time to come up here from Saratoga?
2 hours.
It was nearly 2 hours. And yes, and a lot of it was climbing up the steepness of this mountain here in the last couple of miles. But it was about a 10-mile ride in a carriage. And again, I can imagine that after a bumpy, hot, dusty carriage ride, everybody was a little cranky. But you're going to see what made them feel a little better in just a moment as we head to the next stop as well. So we're going to proceed down to the overlook there, and we're going to gather probably right in the center of the overlook. Alrighty, I think we have everybody just about gathered. Okay, here we are at stop number 2. And it is a showstopper, is it not? Yes. So this is the Great Eastern Outlook, or we call it the Eastern Overlook, because we don't really use the word outlook that much anymore, except for computers. And so here we are at one of the secondary reasons why people came up here. First reasons we talked about. It was getting out of the heat of the cities, and the second reason was the healthy air. Now, number 3 was the beautiful views that you can get from a mountaintop. Again, similar reasons why people built resorts in the Catskill Mountains at elevation. And so we're about 950 feet here above the valley floor. This is the upper Hudson River Valley, and it is an incredibly historic area in its own right. This is the area that saw the clash of empires. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, there was European powers, mainly the French and the English and the Dutch to some extent, and their native allies and enemies fighting over this land right here. And so it saw a lot of warfare in those 200 years, which of course culminated in the American Revolution, which we, as most of you are aware, I'm sure, about 9 miles distance to the southeast, we have the very important battles of Saratoga in 1777, which of course are going to be a very popular theme in the next couple of years as we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. But a little less known activity happened during the early years of the colonial wars. So in 1693, getting pretty early there was the Battle of Wilton just 3 miles down the road. And it's said that this place was used as a scouting location up here on the mountain. But again, that's just what's written down in the paper. We don't know if that's for sure. But the Battle of Wilton occurred just down there, a skirmish between the English and the French and their native allies. So certainly this area was certainly saw its share of conflict. But when the wars you were either in between wars or when the French and Indian wars were over, they had settlement here. And even when General Grant was here in the 1880s, this was still a largely agricultural area. You would not have seen these trees here. You would have seen an incredible expanse of open farmland, a patchwork of open farmland here. Again, it's hard to visualize, but that's what it would be. Now, what you're looking at in terms of geographically, you are looking at the 3 mountain ranges, 3 different states. You have the Catskill Mountains 80 miles to the southeast. You have Albany. You have the Taconic Mountains, also known as partially as the Berkshires. And then you have the Southern Green Mountains, and then the Green Mountains, and the Central Green Mountains, and then some of the Adirondacks peeking out over here. And you can see the highest point of Massachusetts, Mount Greylock. You can also see Killington Mountain in the Central Green Mountains, and some of the mountains that ring the south end of Lake George. So it's an incredible, incredible view, and that did not escape the people of the Victorian era. This is definitely something they would ride up on their carriage, just as I was saying at the last stop. They would ride up on the carriage, all cranky from that hot, bumpy ride up from Saratoga, and they'd get here and forget it all. Just as you're doing right now. It's just a beautiful view, and it just captures the imagination. In fact, a historian from Saratoga County, a 19th century historian, wrote The Historic Muse on Mount McGregor, a little booklet kind of promoting this place. And he said, what if you had drank from the fountain of youth and sat here from the beginning of time all the way through? And of course, that was only until 1880. We're going to pick up where he left off. But he was talking about all the way through the geology and the wars. And that was an inspiration to me to actually put this kind of tour together, to say, okay, well, there's a lot of history all the way from the beginning to the present day. Obviously that historian didn't know it all, but he knew what was happened up into that point where he wrote that in the 1880s. But we're going to take up where he left off as well. And so an incredibly historic area. Now you will see, I'll jump forward a little bit, you see a monument here. I will mention that that was a monument placed here in recognition and memorial to General Grant. They first discussed, after his death here in 1885, carving his face in the front of the mountain. We could have had the very first Mount Rushmore right here in New York State. But it was not to be. They wanted to send all that money down to the Tomb Fund in New York City. So this became what we got as a consolation prize. Instead of Mount Rushmore, we got this small monument acknowledging Grant's last view at the Overlook 3 days before his death. And they had to put a fence around it in the early 20th century because there was souvenir hunters trying to take everything they could off the mountain. That was big back then, before they had smartphones and things like that to take pictures. So any questions so far about the view? Anything about the history here so far?
Why did they stop farming?
Why did they stop farming?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's a bigger question about it's national, on a national scale. Farms have really consolidated into the large farms, and so the smaller farms are harder to keep open, and so a lot of them have closed. Or been bought out by larger farming enterprises. But it's a good question. That's generally why.
Who was the historian?
Oh, I believe it was Sylvester. Nathan Bartlett Sylvester was the historian there that wrote that. The two big buildings are large distribution centers for retailers, Target and Ace Warehouse. Or Ace, they're over 1 million square feet. They are not the most pleasant thing to look at in the view shed, but they do keep the taxes low in the town of Wilton.
So the funeral was held here? The funeral was held here?
His funeral was, General Grant did have a funeral here on the mountain. Now down here would have been the cannons that fired salutes in his honor all day on the 4th of August, 1885, as they were taking him off the mountain there.
Could you just point in the general direction of the Saratoga battlefield?
Yes, the Saratoga battlefield, as it is with the Hudson River, are not visible because of the hills. But it would be generally, you can see a tower over there on one of the first rolling hills, and that is Willard Mountain. And so that's kind of more or less in that general area is where the battlefield would be. But because it's on slopes facing the river, facing the east, you can't really see it, but certainly it's within the view shed. So are the battles of Hubbardton, the battles of Bennington, and of course Albany down here as well. So there's a lot of history to be seen from this view as well.
Ben, why don't you point out where the monument is in Schuylerville?
Yes, feel free to come back down afterwards and try to spot the monument. It is basically just you start from the back corner of the warehouse there and come up, and it is visible right now, but you really have to know where you're looking. It's right where the hills start, and it's right now it's in dark in color, but that's the Saratoga Battle Monument, which General Grant would have seen in 1885 because it had already been erected over there as well.
So his bath wagon came down here too, right?
Yes, General Grant in that stage when he came down here sadly he was in the state where he had to be rolled down in a large wheelchair device. Yes.
There's no point where you see the Hudson.
Keep going towards the mountain.
See the Hudson from here?
No, really not. There's a gray line over here, and that's Saratoga Lake. That's the main body of water you can see from here. Alrighty, so I think we're going to head up. Take your time. This is the steepest portion of the walk. We're going to continue along the carriage road here, up through the woods, and we're going to stop at the junction of the two trails where there's an interpretive panel. So we'll see you up there. Stop number 3, I think we're at here. Stop number 3. Excellent. Okay. All right. So here we are. Where are we standing? We are standing at the intersection of history. But we're standing at an intersection where the original 1872 carriage road meets the railroad. What railroad? We didn't talk about a railroad. Well, we're going to. So in 1881, the end of the year, James Arkell and his son, William James Arkell, and a few other folks, generally from the Mohawk Valley of New York, came up here to the Overlook. I think it was just after President Garfield died. And they came up here for an excursion, and they loved the place. They fell in love with this place, Mount McGregor, and the views, but they said, we have got to do something about that long trip up here. These were wealthy men. The Arkells had made a good deal of money in the paper bag industry during the Civil War. And as you know, the cotton was not so easy to get in the North during that time. So they were doing very well financially. And as people did in the Gilded Age, they made a bit of a pact right there on the Overlook. In 1881, one of the gentlemen, James Kellogg, he says to William J. Arkell, young man in his 20s, he says, WJ, that's what they call him, WJ, would you put money in if to build a railroad up here to get people up here faster? And WJ surprised him. It was almost a joke, but he surprised him, said, I'll put this much in. I think it was something like $100,000, which was a fortune back then. And they actually pooled all their money, all those folks there, and they decided, let's build a railroad. Obviously, more plans were in the works, but the railroad was the first idea. And it was called the Saratoga, Mount McGregor, and Lake George Railroad. Eventually, they would drop the Lake George part because it never made it to Lake George. It did make it up the mountain, though. They built it in 4 months in 1882. WJ, he got his shovel. No, it was built by immigrant labor. Thousands of immigrants worked on this line, and a lot of them were Italians, and they worked on it and they built it straight up the mountain. It was an incredible feat of engineering, and they completed it in only 4 months. It ran for about 11 miles from North Broadway up here, but it did not follow the same tracks as the D&A. It followed the D&H tracks, the main tracks up the valley, but because it was narrow gauge, 3-foot rails instead of 4.5-foot rails that are standard, it had to have its own tracks. And so it ran from North Broadway all the way up here. And the fare was $1 to come up to Mount McGregor. To take an excursion up here, it was $1 for a round-trip fare. Now, a lot of people, came up here. In William James Arkell, WJ, I'll call him from now on. WJ was a very ambitious young man, very ambitious. In his 20s, he had almost lost his life in a terrible explosion and fire at his father's mill when he was a bit younger, when he was a teenager. But he survived, and apparently this gave him quite the zest for life. And he was a character as well. He owned Judge magazine, which was the first a real full-color political satire magazine, political cartoons. It was an incredible magazine. We'll see a copy of it up on the top of the mountain when we get there. But he used it in promotional terms. This wild stories he used as promotional items in the newspapers. One of the articles, and it doesn't say who wrote it, but one of the articles said that this man, William James Arkell, was an incredible man because after his great accident and 6 other railroad accidents, which never happened, he received this is a newspaper report from the time, 806 skin grafts from 806 different people. And and he received a little bit of their stamina, each one of those 800 people, to come up here and do something like he was doing. So that one might not be true, a little bit of 19th century fake news maybe. But then we also have him putting an article out about some English visitors to Saratoga Springs that were so excited. They wanted to see how fast the railroads were in America. And so they got on the Mount McGregor Railroad and came up here. Now, they complained to WJ. They said, it was much slower than we expected. And he said, well, gentlemen, if that's the case, why don't you let me take you down the mountain? And I'll show you how fast we can go. So the story in the paper says that they all boarded the train. WJ got up and was conductor there and an engineer or whatnot. And supposedly they saw a streak of lightning, the people in the valley going down the mountain. And when the dust settled, it was a 45-minute trip, mind you, normally, from here down to Saratoga. Better than the 2 hours in the carriage, but they made it down there in 12 minutes. Yes, and WJ gets off the train, goes back to see these poor English gentlemen, and he can't find them. They're hiding under the seats. They said, "Are we dead, sir?" "No, you're not. No." And he said, I know that may not have been as fast as you would like. We can go back up, and I think we could shave another minute or two off of it. So there's some wonderful stories that kind of brought attention to this place in that era to generate some interest, even if the stories were a little bit absurd and a little bit over the top. But it is going to be William James is going to be a big part of this. Some other investors. His father had been a state senator, James, but he really was the driving force. And they basically more or less took over from Mr. McGregor, and they started putting in some plans. Mr. McGregor, mind you, had thought about a railroad. He had started to put carriage roads in. He did build the first small hotel and restaurant up here. So that was operating in the 1870s. But in the 1880s, the Arkells and the other investors are going to be the ones that are going to expand the resort. Now, the railroad dropped the visitors off down, and we'll see pictures of the train station and everything later. But right down across from the visitor center is right where the platform was for visitors to disembark, and they'd go up to the big resort. We'll talk about that later. But this was still the railroad, and it came down through, and right to where the yellow sign is, that's where the last train shed of the night was. And they'd keep the train there. They didn't need a turnstile because the engines could run forward and backward. They did have a side track, so they could couple the cars on the back side. But it could run either way. I think brakes were the most important. In fact, the very last year the resort was open, everyone got off of one of the engines, and then it went back down the mountain on its own, and it went right off the tracks. So it was a bit of a dangerous thing, but that was the only major issue that we know of, and nobody got killed. Nobody was on the train. A little bit of a runaway train there. But we'll talk about why that last year of the resort was a bad year overall. So that's where the last train shed was. And again, at this time, there was a lot of folks that wanted the 3-foot narrow gauge railroad. They thought it would take over. They thought it would be better. It could make tighter corners, could go through different terrain. And some of them were built, but it never replaced the standard gauge. I'll give a little promo for our friends over at the Saratoga-Corinth Scenic Railway. They do a great job preserving history over there. They do scenic train rides from Corinth through Greenfield. We can head up to the next location. I will mention, as you walk by, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, as you walk by, we have a photograph that we acquired from the Victorian era that shows a staircase. And it's right, and we were able to locate exactly where it was, right on these cliffs. Because the two boulders that were there in 1880s are still there. So you'll see two very distinct boulders there. They're kind of just up on the right there. You'll see these boulders about this high as you walk by, and that's where that was. And we can take a look at, I can pass around a picture when we get up to our next location showing you that as well. All right, we're going to head up to the top of the trail, take a right, follow the road up, and go to the picnic tables. That's our next stop. Resort developers, Arkell and others, had big plans for this place, right? So they had big plans, but the problem was it takes a while to build a large hotel, which was what they planned. So there's a bunch of people want to come up, 1882, 1883, a bunch of people want to come up on the train. They can handle a bunch of passengers, but all they have is Mr. McGregor's old hotel, the small hotel that can only hold about 20 visitors. That's it. That's not going to work. So what do? Well, they get inventive. They decide to offer glamping. 19th century glamping. They had fancy wall tents set up right in this area. They had wall tents, and they had an artesian well with a ladder you could go up if you were daring enough to the top to get a view. And the wall tents had, carpets in them, and they had beds in them. And the advertisement said, after a night under the canvas, you won't want to go home. Yes, and of course, they always build it as a health resort. They said if your hay fever is not cured, your stay is free. Yeah, so this was always billed as a health resort, an excursion point from Saratoga Springs. That was always what it was. So that's going to happen for a couple of years. During this time, they also build the Mount McGregor Art Gallery. They put it over on Artist Lake, which is behind that building over there, at the head of the lake, and it for 2 years it hosted some of the greatest American artists, Beard, Stott, Moran, and they had their works right in there and actually sold thousands of dollars, which is much more today, of artwork out of that gallery. So you can imagine people glamping, going over to an art gallery and buying fancy artwork. That's what was going on in the early stages of the resort expansion. But the centerpiece of the resort was being worked on. W.J.R. Kell got his hammer out. No, it was immigrant labor again that's going to build this incredible mountaintop luxury resort. And they're going to name it the Hotel Balmoral. It's 100 rooms. It's 3-sided so that everybody gets as good a view as possible. And they're going to build it right up in this field up here behind the fence line. And that, again, is going to be the center point of the resort. They're going to have excursions on carriages and horseback to different locations around the mountaintop. There was miles of carriage roads. They tried for a while to get people to build cottages up here, a cottage community. Never took on. In fact, the hotel had issues throughout its existence with financial issues. They obviously kept that under wraps, and it was always a good front they put on. And they had a lot to offer. If you came up here, you could take advantage of the wonderful restaurant with a really high-end cook from down in New York City. You could take in the views from up in front of the hotel as well. You could go up to the very top of the hotel where there was an observation deck where you could see for hundreds of miles. They had running water. They had electric lighting in some areas. They had gas lighting. They had indoor plumbing. This place had it all. Obviously, why did they have all this? Well, because the clientele was mainly coming from Saratoga Springs. And Saratoga Springs, as you know, had some of the biggest and most well-equipped hotels in the world in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And so this was a golden area for the area, and they wanted to match that. They had a bowling alley. They had early lawn tennis courts. They had an all-ladies orchestra that played orchestra music on the porches. They had fireworks. They had dances. So all this was going on up here to draw visitors up from Saratoga Springs. So this was a very busy, bustling place. The hotel opened in 1884. The very next year would be when General Grant came here, and he would stay in the old hotel, which was moved from its original location down to a new foundation over here during the construction of the Balmoral. And we assume they did it on logs with horse teams, but that's how they did that back then. Moving an entire building was something you could do if you had enough money. You can just about do anything back then. So the Hotel Balmoral, anybody know the reference? Yes, it's a Royal British estate in Scotland. It was in the news in the past few years because that's where Queen Elizabeth died. They would go and rule over the Scots for a month every year. It was an old tradition. But that was built in the mid-19th century to look like an older castle. And so it made sense, if you already have the name Mount McGregor, why not stick with the Scottish theme? And that's what happened. They went with Balmoral. And there are many other Hotel Balmorals around the world. It was just a regal sounding name. And they wanted that kind of atmosphere up here. Any questions so far?
How many rooms did the hotel have?
It had 100 rooms. So they claimed that you could get at least 300 guests, 3 people per room, a little cozy. But they had big, wide porches, just like the Cottage has over here. They had 22-foot wide porches. Each face of the hotel was over 100 feet long. So about 300 feet of frontage on the front side of the hotel. So it was a very large hotel, 3.5 stories when you count the observation deck. So it was an incredible hotel, and there are some images that we'll see up top there.
So what's the scoop of 3 people per room? Is that an odd number?
Well, I think it was the same as the height of the mountain, right? So the height of the mountain when they first started advertising was 1,100 feet. The next year it was 1,200. The next year was 1,300 feet. And it just kept going up to 1,500. So the idea is, they make it sound accommodating, large, luxurious. That was the whole theme behind the Gilded Age.
So what were the glory years for the hotel?
84 to 97. Yeah, that's essentially the Obviously there was people coming up here in smaller fashion during McGregor's years, but in the 70s.
What was the standard amount of stay? How many nights would they stay here usually? They didn't stay for the whole season, right?
Right, they had deals. You had your prices. Some people just came up for the restaurant to walk around and utilize the amenities. Other people would stay, for the night or a week. They'll give you a deal if you stay for a week. And then some people would book rooms for the season. But I think it's kind of like Saratoga, where you have a place, but you may only come up for a few weeks. It's yours all summer, if you have enough money. It's yours all summer, but you own it or you've spoken for it. So yeah, the rooms in the early years especially did get spoken for. And of course, the papers would have all the famous people and well-known people and where they were staying in each hotel. And obviously the Balmoral was a location. Arthur MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's father or grandfather, I can't remember, did stay up here quite a lot. He was a famous visitor. Susan B. Anthony stayed a night here. And Benjamin Harrison had a birthday dinner and stayed here as well while he was president in 1881. And Oscar Wilde came on a trip to America. He came up here to Mount McGregor and said it's a beautiful place. So we did get the endorsement of Oscar Wilde.
How come the fences?
The fence, well, we're going to talk about that part of the history. That's a little bit more modern, but we're going to cover that in the next section.
Was the restaurant next to the hotel?
It was in part of it, yeah. The earlier resort had a separate restaurant because, again, it generated heat. And all the family, the Grant party while they were here, were actually accommodated for all their food at the restaurant. So they had a private dining room while they were here in 1885. Alrighty, so I think we can head up to our next location, which is under the tent there. Excellent, okay, so all right, here we are in the location of the great Hotel Balmoral. Had a good run. I don't know if we have the image here, but this is a little piece of history that was unearthed recently by a storm. So this is the drainage channels that used to go underneath. They were segmented, and they used to go under the different carriage roads. So that's a little piece of the old resort there that decided to come and say hi to us. Again, as I mentioned, W.J.R. Kell, we have one image of him. There he is, sitting later in his life. He was a very driven man, a very opinionated man, and didn't back down from a fight. He got in a little bit of trouble because his driver ran over a little girl and killed her in New York City, and he took off before he got in trouble out to California. So things got a little hot for him towards the end. But he loved California. He stayed out there the rest of his life. But he said that Mount McGregor was a failure overall. He had great hopes for it, but a lot of things in the Gilded Age, well, it was boom or bust. You put a lot of money into something, and it doesn't always work out for different reasons. And so this resort, even though it looked good on the surface, always struggled. They did have high points, like when President Benjamin Harrison, they had a birthday dinner for him up here right after he dedicated the Bennington Battle Monument over in, I think it's Rensselaer County. So this is an invitation to that birthday dinner, an original invitation with a seating chart as well. And one of the people at that, besides the president, was Bernard Gillum, who was a brother-in-law to our Cal. And Gillum was a famous cartoonist for Judge magazine. So a little connection there too. And so they did have presenters of different kinds come to the resort as well for entertainment. Now the hotel changed hands a few times. The 1890s were not a good time for national finance. And so they ended up closing it for 2 years. So they didn't open it. People could still come to Mount McGregor. This is in the 1890s. They had trouble in Saratoga as well in the 1890s. Everywhere around the country, a lot of resorts struggled during these years. So a couple of years it closed. Now they tried to kind of come out of that funk in 96 and 97. And they're trying to get this thing. They had gone through a series of different proprietors running the place. There was lawsuits about not paying for the goods here and all that. Arkell had already gotten out of the business. He had gotten out of it. In fact, he tried to give it to the federal government to use as a consumptive home for Civil War veterans, which consumption is tuberculosis. And so that's interesting. Also, General Grant, before he died, said something very prescient as well. He said, someday maybe they'll build a great sanatorium here. So 1897, they start off big. They've got brochures. They're excited. The newly renovated Hotel Balmoral open for business this summer. But it would be a tragic year because before the end of that year, the hotel would be gone. On a early winter's night, December 1st, 1897, the caretakers of the hotel had a boarder up in the front room over there, the cottage. She woke in about just after midnight to a great glow in her room. She looked out her window and saw the hotel was completely engulfed in flames. Now, this was a summer resort, so there was no one present in the building. The caretaker was on premises for the hotel, but he was not inside the hotel building, and in fact did not even know it was on fire. So this fire was already too big to handle, and certainly in the wintertime, trying to get firefighting equipment up here. Now, they did have some hoses in the building and firefighting equipment, like those little toss bombs. You might have seen them, those little glass bombs of some awful chemical that probably made things worse. But that's what they had. But of course, no one was there to use them, and the hoses were shut off for the winter. So they effectively had no way to fight this fire. So fortunately, the other buildings in the cottage survived, but the hotel, it was an incredible fire. It burned so bright that someone pulled the alarm in the street down in Glens Falls, 9 miles away, thinking that there was a fire in the city because there was clouds that night, and it lit up Corinth over here, the village of Corinth, like it was daytime. It was an incredibly large fire. Everything burned to the ground. Now, the papers tried to decide what happened. Now, there were some workmen here painting the day before, and they may have left a fireplace on, and they had their oily rags and whatnot. So it's possible there was combustion there. There was obviously accusations, even from Arkell, that he said the people bought it and torched it for the insurance money. So that's what Arkell thought. But yeah, it's certainly possible, because a few years ago I picked up a small bottle from the 1880s that had the label on it still, and it was a little cork top bottle. It said gasoline. And I found out that they actually used it back then before they were using it in vehicles. They used it for as a solvent. It did say flammable. I'll give them that credit on the front. But so it certainly could have happened. There could have been an accident, especially if they left a fire unchecked there in the fireplace. But that was the end of that resort era. And it was a difficult life for the caretakers. They were the only ones up here trying to keep the cottage running in those early years of the 20th century. There was much talk about turning it into a park even back then, or possibly building different things up here. But eventually the MetLife Insurance Company, Metropolitan Life, the biggest employer in the country at the time, decided they were going to build a sanatorium for their employees, which is quite astonishing thinking about this early era of the 20th century. You think of the book, what was it called? The Jungle. This was an era where they really didn't take care of employees very well. They generally abused them. And so to have this company step forward and say, we're going to take care of our employees that are sick. They would test all their employees. Anybody that tested positive, even if they weren't showing symptoms, would be sent to their new Mount McGregor Sanatorium, MetLife Sanatorium. And so that's going to be built between 1910 and 1913. It's going to be completed, and the first patients are going to come in the end of 1913 and be dedicated the very next year. It's a very large facility right off the bat. They've got at least 10 major buildings, but they keep adding on to it until there's almost 30 major buildings by the late 1920s. They did have room for other patients, so they had this dormitory was built in two sections over the years. The TB patients were on the front slope, in front of where you parked your cars down there in front of the facility. They had 6 ward buildings, 3 for the men, 3 for the women on the front slope, and then this was for non-tuberculosis patients in what they called the rest house over here. So they could accommodate non-TB patients as well. Most of them were TB in the early years. It was built they quarried the stone right off the mountain here, and the stone is incredible. In fact, our visitor center's original 1916 carriage house this is what the walls are made out of. Natco fire brick, they called it. So it's a hollow brick, but it's supposed to resist fire. Obviously, fire was the biggest issue back then, with buildings. So behind the gray facade is this fire brick is what makes up the buildings, with the exception of the modern gymnasium over here, which we'll mention in a moment. So the sanatorium, what did they do with this field? Well, the old hotel was gone. They actually played baseball here. The Mount McGregor Marvels baseball team played right up in this field, and they had plenty of spectators. They had big bleachers out here for all the spectators that came to see them play as well. Now, it was a self-sustaining community. They had everything they needed up here. 350 patients at its peak capacity, and almost all the staff lived up here too. The building that's peeking out from the woods over there was the head physician's home. And we'll be able to see that a bit better as we walk that way later on. Now, they're going to have dorms for the nurses, dorms for the male nurses and female nurses, and then they're also going to have dorms for the doctors and their families, little houses. And most of them all still exist. And so they had their own farms in the valley down around where the warehouses are now. They had farms to produce everything they needed, dairy, vegetables, huge operations down there to supply the place. They had their own post office. They had their own chapel. They had their own movie theater, a 350-seat movie theater where they saw performances. They had a large dining hall where they had major community gatherings. And people would come up here for as long as it took. Maybe the average was about 18 months, but some people stayed here over 10 years. Many did survive their ordeal because of the good treatment they had. Fresh food, exercise, fresh air, and not having to work. They did take them out of work. Some people, but they kept themselves busy. They had their own little newspaper, and people contributed to that, their own little newsletter. They did poetry, they did walks, they did all sorts of things, and baseball. So they were active. They weren't all bedridden. They were active patients. And so a lot of people that are from this area have ancestors that used to work at the sanatorium and its later manifestation. So that ran for 30 years until 1945. And TB, as you know, with antibiotics was starting to diminish as a concern. And so the state of New York bought this place and turned the entire facility into a veterans rest camp. It was an immediate changeover. This was not a hospital. This was a rest camp. So veterans were allowed to come here for 3 months at a time and basically hang out with other veterans. Usually there was maybe a reason. You didn't have to have a reason. Maybe you were recovering from some sort of surgery. And obviously in the early years, it was decompressing from the war itself. But it actually lasted for nearly 15 years. It actually, 1960 would be the next time the state would repurpose the facility. And again, during that time, right where we're sitting, still a baseball field. This time it's veterans have their own team. And again, the veterans are going to have vocational training here. They're going to have activities. So it was an interesting period. And so thousands and thousands of veterans came here over those years. Now, Cottage was also visited in these years by veterans as well. Every Memorial Day, they would come up here and bring new flowers and new flag. And so it was cared for and open to the public this whole time. In 1960, the state of New York would repurpose the facility into a developmental center. And it would actually run as a developmental center until the early 1970s, when they started building another facility down on Ballard Road in the Valley. And again, obviously, that's all been phased into home living now. But it was institutional at that time, and it ran for many years as that developmental center as well. And again, a decent amount of the staff lived here, and some of them lived off-site as well. Now, its most recent use, was kind of due to circumstances. As you may know, in the 1970s, they instituted the Rockefeller drug laws, exactly, and in a broader sense, the war against drugs. Now, again, you can debate the fairness or the necessity of any of that, but the idea is that it did end up filling the prison system to the brink in the into 1970s. And so what they did was the corrections saw that this place was closing, Corrections Department in New York, and they actually kind of took their opportunity and started to put minimum security work camp prisoners in here in 1977. Sadly, they were talking right before this happened about turning it into a state park, the whole thing. But somebody else stepped in again. So they stepped in and they started using they called it Camp Walkaway at first. You know, these were minimum security prisoners locked in at night. Sometimes they, this is stories, of course, but sometimes they would, find the prisoners down at the local bar and bring them back, But it was, and later on they would, in the early 80s, they would install the fences you see now, and they would turn it into a combination minimum medium security correctional facility, which would operate all the way until about 11 years ago. The minimum security section, they called that Camp Cupcake, that closed down earlier, and then the medium security was closed down afterwards. But it operated for all those years, nearly 4 decades, and wasn't the easiest thing to have the historic site right next door. It did provide good security, but it wasn't the red carpet for visitors coming up here to have to check in with your ID and deal with the dog sniffing your vehicle for drugs. And checking your trunk for escaped prisoners on the way out. So it was an oddball situation for many years, but we kept the place going, and we did outlive them. Now, a couple of things I find interesting. We have the softballs. The prisoners played softball up here in this field, and they had their rec area just down below here where we have a parking area now. But this is a original softball that, it made a home run for it. More like a foul ball, but that doesn't sound as good. So we have some of those for sale, actually, in our gift shop. If you want a very interesting souvenir, they are limited edition now. And this I always found interesting. This is an original posted sign. And what I find very interesting about it is it says no trespass, which should be enough. You would think no trespass is no trespass. But underneath, it kind of specifies some things. And I find one of them quite interesting. No hunting, no fishing, no trapping, no swimming, no berry picking. No berry picking. If you look around, especially up in this area under the oaks, you will see a lot of blueberries. So there was berry picking of different kinds that was available up here. But apparently they felt the need to put that on the sign. So there was an individual in the correctional facility named Vincent Harris, and he had served a very long term for murder in the 70s. And he had taught himself how to paint. And they basically allowed him, when he came up here for the end of his sentence, it was a 30-some-odd year sentence, when he came up here for the end of his sentence, they allowed him to paint murals on the inside walls of the correctional facility in different areas. In fact, we have 2 paintings that he gave to the historic site in our visitor center on display in our video room. So if you want to see a little bit of his work, you can see that. You cannot see the work inside the buildings. They're off limits. They're no trespassing. They're still owned by corrections at this time. We do have the original home base as well that the prisoners used there. Yeah. So the correctional facility would close down for the opposite reason that it opened. Basically, you have the reduction of prison sentences for drug offenses, bail reform, and some other things, basically reducing drastically the prison population. Might have less criminals, we just have less criminals in prison now. So so basically what occurs is they are consolidating the entire system. This is not a one-off. They have reduced by 75% the correctional facility system in the state of New York. So this was just one of many that has closed over the last 20 years. And this was a bit archaic. They would actually, all the way from the earliest years, all the way up into the end of the prison, they would pipe in water all the way from Lake Bonita, which is nearly a mile away, pipe it into the steam plant that you pass by, and then the steam plant would send through underground tunnel there, through the pipes, would send steam heat up to a lot of the buildings. They didn't have fiber optic up here at all, so that it was not an updated facility. Very hard to maintain the roadway in the wintertime, so it makes sense why the state would close it. Obviously, the employees weren't happy about it when it closed, or any of the facilities. But it's a new phase of the mountain now. We were excited, but we were also challenged by the closure. because it was the end of this long era of having to share the mountain with something that wasn't too inviting to the public. And once that was over, we were excited because we thought, more people would come, and they did. But we had all our utilities coming into the buildings from that facility. And so over the last 10 years, our goal as the Friends of Grant Cottage has been to not only make sure we have everything we need to keep the historic site running, which included drilling our own well, putting in a fire protection system, putting in more security, and putting in a solar array system, which we are the only state park or historic site in the entire state of New York to be fully off-grid. We have 75 batteries and 90 solar panels running both buildings year-round. Now, it's funny to say because back when they had electric lights here on the property, they had a big Edison generator to run them. And they would shut them off at 10 p.m. every evening because the guests would complain about the noise and the smell of the generator. Now we're back to having a generator backup now if we need it, but we don't have anybody up here to complain about it when it turns on. But it's interesting to think how 100 years ago they were enjoying electricity through a generator system back then. That's the only way you could do it back then. They even had in the resort era they even had a telephone, not just a telegraph, but a telephone line going to Saratoga. You could order your meal after the races, get on the train, come up here, and have your meal ready for you when you got up here. The lap of luxury on Mount McGregor at the Hotel Balmoral. And so that brings us pretty much up to today. And I will take any questions you have. Now, we do have big plans. I will mention this as well. We appreciate everybody's support. I will put a pitch out there as well for the fact that we're a nonprofit that runs this for the state of New York, that runs the historic site. After 7 years of pestering, we finally got corrections to transfer the property we're on now. This was not part of the historic site before. So we pestered and pestered and pestered. We were persistent, just like General Grant. And we got this piece of land, these few acres, and it is a beautiful piece of land, a very historic property. And like I said, we're so excited that we can bring you up here today to talk about this history. We're going to take the fences down, most of them anyway, and then we're going to put in a permanent pavilion here. And we're going to have a nice big overlook deck built off the side of the mountain. So those are the plans we have, and we have other plans. As I said, we were going to, earlier, maybe you didn't hear me, but we're also going to do a fully accessible path to the overlook. We're going to redo that whole path we walked down today so that people of all abilities can get down to the overlook. Just like General Grant got that down there in the wheelchair, we want to make sure everybody has a chance to see that beautiful view as well, but we'll always have this view as a secondary view. And as I mentioned, actually, this is a great time. Mike can pass them out. These are QR codes that you can use with your phone. I have a series that's up to 3 articles now. There's going to be, I think, 3 more articles that are going to come out. They're about the early resort. Has tons of extra pictures that you didn't get to see today, tons of explanation that you didn't get. So this gives you a deeper dive. And it also has an interactive map I've created on Google Maps of the different eras of the mountain. So you can click and see the different buildings, what they were used for. So that's all the stuff I didn't have time to go into today. But I hope you enjoyed what we were able to do.